A very good evening to you. Welcome to this week's Thursday edition of The Watchdog. My name is Vuyo Mvogo. Finance Minister Tito Mboweni and his team may now have to run with it. But the idea is neither his nor Treasury's. And so tonight on the show, we look at the origins as well as the pros and cons of the move to allow people to withdraw a part of their pensions in order to survive these difficult times. But first, once upon a time, the poster child of an efficient, well-run public institution, or what a well-run public institution could do before, of course, it was hollowed out through stage capture and corruption. It looks like SARS is now well on its way to regain its former glory. Commissioner Edward Kisweta takes us through the trials and tribulations, how they are winning taxpayers' trust again, and his vision for the long road ahead. The Watchdog starts now. The looting and destruction we saw earlier this month in Gauteng and KwaZulu-Natal is going to cost the economy about 50 billion rands. And to cushion the blow, Finance Minister Tito Mboweni yesterday presented a 36 billion rand socio-economic relief package, thanks in large part to taxes paid by the financial and mining sectors of our economy. The good news is that the government won't have to borrow to fund that relief package. But even more good news was shared yesterday. The revelation that SARS has jacked up its machinery, regaining the taxpayers' trust, and the future looks bright with promise. Joining us now to talk about it all, let's welcome SARS Commissioner Edward Kisweta. Good evening, Commissioner, and thank you very much for your time this evening. If you can unmute yourself, Commissioner.
Theo, good evening and nice to be with you.
Good, thank you very much. Thanks for agreeing to come through this evening. Good news we had yesterday. What did it take to get to where you are now?
I think it's important to know that over the last 2 years, we have begun a very steady but very clear path of rebuilding the revenue services. And it started out by reconfirming within the organization not only what our legal mandate is, but what our higher purpose is. In other words, to remind ourselves that the work we do has a transformative impact on our young democracy. And I think the last week, with the President and the Minister's announcement, cannot bear that out more clearly, that when you have a well-functioning revenue authority, it touches the lives of people in material ways. And so that's where the journey started. We clearly had to address some leadership integrity issues. We had to also ensure that we strengthen the leadership system within SARS and then provide clarity to our organization, to the 12,000 or more employees, so that they could be inspired and clear about what it is we want to achieve. And I think that's where the journey started. Important also is, specifically in respect of revenue, it was to clarify that SARS cannot just sit there and wait for taxpayers to receive money. We actually have to go out and collect money. And so a huge focus on how we have conceptualized our strategic intent, very clear strategic objectives. And if we have time, I can unpack those. But a singular focus on saying is what is the work we have to do? We call that our compliance program, in order to ensure that whatever the economy produces, that the tax revenue that is due, in fact, does end up in the government purse. Because we cannot assume that just because a sector does well, that all of that money will end up in the fiscus. And so it is the work that we do that really closes the gap between what taxpayers give of their own volition versus that which is actually due. And again, it's an area where I would love to unpack more of it, depending on how you'd like to take this conversation.
Let's do that, but let's start, Commissioner, with your workforce, the 12,000 or so people. When you got there, if I still recall, I mean, you did say that there were lots, in fact, great majority of the people who were there were hardworking, very committed, and they were keen to see this organization getting back to what it once was. Remind us again of the sort of things that these people encountered that made them not to give their best, or that hindered those who actually wanted to give their best.
Well, a number of things happened over the time period that Nugent report covers. He captures it very nicely under the phrase that there was a hollowing out of capacity and a breakdown in governance and integrity. So let me give some of the examples. In my first stint at SARS, I was actually responsible for setting up the large business division, a division with a singular focus on managing the end-to-end tax matters of large corporates. That entire unit was dismantled and the impact was diluted. Another important capacity was the integrity and compliance unit in SARS. That ensures that our own staff is held to a higher standard that we expect of taxpayers. That unit was destroyed. The litigation unit, the High Court litigation unit, that focuses our efforts when we are in disputes with taxpayers, that was diluted. So these are some of the organizational arrangements that was just completely dissipated, and instead of having centers of excellence, it was then distributed across the organization. Another area was how tax settlements were dealt with, for example. Now, a tax settlement is permitted in law, but has to take place within the well-governed confines of settlement committees and clear delegations of authority. I would never, as a commissioner, sit with a taxpayer one-on-one and negotiate a tax settlement. That would expose me, and it would also just be poor governance. So when one begins to look for ways to bypass those governance structures, then you have to ask, what is the real intent? The manipulation of refunds was another area that we were, in the end, criticized for. And so these are some of the examples. Then in relation to the level of trust between employees and the leadership, it had completely broken down. A culture of fear and intimidation settled in. There was a disconnect between leaders and the organization. And that was palpable when I joined and visited people in the front lines, on the ground, as it were. And people with tears in their eyes shared with me their experience. And then one more example, and then I'll pause, is taking out seasoned professionals. When I arrived there were about 60 seasoned professionals, tried and tested. They have career officials at SARS. They were simply marginalized. They were taken out of their roles. And in their place, good people, but people who did not have the experience were put in their place, whilst these seasoned professionals were marginalized and prevented from doing work. They were giving all sorts of arbitrary titles. And when I personally engage with many of them, I ask them, what do you do? And they tell me nothing. And I say, you're joking. You can't mean that you do nothing. They say, yes, I do nothing. I'm not on anyone's mailing list. So when I arrive in the morning, I switch on my computer and I wait for general news flashes and mail, but I don't have any work. And so those are some of the examples of what sadly had happened during this time.
Now, talk to us about how then or to what extent you were able to take those that had already left the organization to come back, with all the institutional memory and experience that they would have had. How successful were you in bringing such people back and to rebuild the units you're saying were hollowed out and destroyed, basically?
So very quickly, we re-established some of those capacities. We re-established the large business division. We re-established the integrity unit, the anti-corruption unit. We introduced a chief litigation officer to set up a very focused litigation unit. And I can tell you already in that regard, we have seen success. Our litigation success rate last year was 92%. And it shows you what you can do if you have a focused effort. We have seen significant improvement in the compliance levels of large business. We reported that at the last public report. We are still struggling in some areas, but in the large business area, we have seen significant turnaround in compliance levels. We have now established another unit for high wealth individuals, and we expect to see a similar focus and therefore a similar compliance dividend in that regard. In respect of people who were still in SARS, I literally in my first few months had one-on-ones with all of these people and reassigned them to meaningful roles. I had many conversations with some of these professionals, and they would come into my office or I would go to theirs, and when I assigned them a meaningful role, they just cry. Because for them it is unbelievable that they thought after so many years they were just shoved to one side, and that now there was a meaningful re-engagement. For employees who had left, that's still a process that we are engaged in. A number of those have come back, and many of them now have a sense that SARS is once again an organization they can be proud to be associated with. Their personal reputations and careers are no longer at risk, and they are coming back. Many of the people that we are interviewing for the positions that we've advertised are people who have had previous SARS experience, but who left in the last 7 years or so. But it's not going to be a weekend wonder. Let me tell you, there are no easy wins. It is hard work, and it is about winning the hearts and minds of 12,500 people, one individual at a time.
Now, organizations like yours who share the same history, one can think here of your NPAs and several others. Even though there's a great deal of support, and these organizations have had new people at the helm who are trying to do all the good things that need to be done. You've also had a lot of them, most if not all of them, have had serious, financial constraints. In other words, it hasn't been easy to actually acquire the kinds of skills that would give you the quick turnaround that you need, hitting the ground running, so to speak. Has the experience been different on your side? Have you had the kinds of resources that you need to be able to restore both the credibility and the capacity of the institution?
So some of the unfortunate consequences of the resource challenges that government has had, unfortunately, when National Treasury did budget cuts, they cut across the board, and SARS therefore was one of those casualties. And that did mean that for a number of years successively, there was no real increase in the budget allocation to SARS. It also meant that we had to freeze all vacancies. We had to discontinue bursary and internment programs, and overall, our employee value proposition was in a decline. Thankfully, we have made a case to the Minister and to our colleagues in National Treasury, and I believe that there is now a more of an aligned sense that, in fact, more than ever before, when you are short of revenue, the one area where you don't want to cut revenue is the very organ of state that is creating revenue. And so you should actually invest more in SARS. So I think that is better understood than what it was a few years ago. But at the same time, SARS has to demonstrate that it can be good resource stewards. We have to be good stewards over these resources, especially in times that are scarce. And in the past, we may also have let ourselves down as far as that is concerned. But very slowly, some of the additional resources have allowed us to begin to recruit in areas of specialized skills, both on the tax side, on the legal side, and on the financial structuring side, but also in areas that will ensure that we build and future-proof the organization. So areas of technology innovation, areas of data analytics and data science to employ more and more artificial intelligence and to augment human effort with the work that supercomputers can do. And so our modernization program, both on the tax and the customs side, have now been repositioned. And it will take us the next few years to slowly reinstate the level of investment, both in people and technology, that an organization with the mandate of SARS and the complexity of SARS has. But we are very encouraged that this work is well underway, and the result of some of the focus, the early dividend, is what allows us to see a better than expected revenue recovery.
Well, when you say you being understood, I take that to mean you expecting a cent or two more to help you, continue to build the capacity you've started building.
I think it would be, I would expect that SARS is funded at an appropriate level. So in nominal terms, and this is on public record, and I reported it in Parliament, in nominal terms, the allocation to SARS for the previous 7 to 8 years have largely been flat, which means that in real terms, that has gone backwards by the rate of inflation every year. We are still not at the level where we need to be resourced, but we understand that this will take place over a number of budget allocation cycles. But as long as the trend is improving, I think we can in any case, let me tell you, it takes focused effort to spend R1 billion. And you also need to build the internal capability to develop a good business case, to develop a strong financial model for an investment, and then to project manage it with discipline. And so we are building the road as we're walking it. We literally, or as they say, we are changing, upgrading the crew as we're flying the plane. We are upgrading the motors and the engines, and we are re-instrumenting the cockpit. And we're doing all of this in flight. And so it does take time. But as long as when we make a business case to our colleagues in Treasury and to the Minister, to the Budget Committee of Ministers, if there is a proper understanding that SARS is not a cost center but an investment center, we believe we will get the necessary support.
And I mean, for them to be able to listen to you a lot more, they would also have to be sympathetic to you. They would need to be convinced that the stewardship you were talking about has indeed improved significantly, and considering the fact that you're coming from that background that you spoke about earlier, and that is well captured in the Nugent Commission report, you have plugged those holes, so to speak, and not only that, and that you've been able to bring on like not only additional capacity, but extra vigilance?
And it's definitely both. It is the extra capacity, but also the additional focus. And that we have seen. So the headline that caught your producer's attention was the fact that we said SARS has delivered the best revenue results, first quarter results in the over the last three quarters. So let me just give you some color to that. In the 2019-20 financial year, in quarter one, SARS collected 316 billion rand. Now remember, that was the year pre-COVID. Then in the same quarter, in the middle of COVID, when we had the hard lockdown, that dropped from 316 or 317 billion rand, it dropped to just over 242 billion rand. We continued our effort, and notwithstanding the tax relief measures that was given, the quarter one for this year, we have delivered 378 billion rand. So if you think 2 years ago, 3 quarters ago, 317 billion, and in quarter one now, while we are still in a fairly muted economic environment compared to the same year, we have delivered the results that I've just shared. So that's hard evidence that suggests that the investment in SARS is yielding dividend. Let me share with you another data point, because we believe evidence-based arguments are much better than ideological or emotionally motivated arguments. We had a huge focus in 2019 on, I mentioned earlier, on what we call compliance revenue. It is revenue that we can link through specific actions that SARS takes. Let me give you an example of that. When SARS raises an additional assessment, it goes onto our debt book as a liability in SARS's favor. But many taxpayers don't pay that. And if SARS is not diligent in following that up and arguing its case strongly, a significant portion of that will remain unrecovered, and it will just age until eventually it is uncollectible. We have seen fraudulent refunds. These are taxpayers, particularly in the VAT area, but also in other areas, where taxpayers deliberately target the refund system by registering fake companies with no intention to trade in order to get access to refunds, and then after 3 or 4 months they collapse the entity and just start a new one. So by doing more data analytical and artificial intelligence work, we have been able to place a huge spotlight on preventing fraudulent refunds. So let me give you what that means in terms of rands and cent. In last year, not last year, the year before last, we, from our compliance effort, we collected 128 billion rand. Last year, we improved that to 172 billion, or a 34% increase. In that, about 57 billion was preventing fraudulent refunds from flowing out, and the balance was collected from additional taxes and diligently following up, raising additional taxes through our audit and investigation work, and then working hard to ensure that that money is collected and banked. So just the compliance dividend from the work we do last year has, of the revenue result that we announced, just the compliance dividend is almost 10%, more than 10% of the total revenue that we collected. And I think that begins to make the case that every rand that government invests in SARS, we can return a multiple of between 10 and 100. So if you think about it, what that means is if SARS has a budget of 10 billion rand, on that basis, we recover or collect 1.35 trillion rand. So already there, we are less than 10 cents in every rand that we collect. And if we continue to focus on that, every additional rand that we give, we are confident that we will return at least 10 rand, but anywhere between 10 and 100 rand on every rand that governments invest in SARS. There is no better return that many other businesses can report.
Of course, the Minister of Finance is famous for a lot of things, and one of them, as someone reminded me a couple of hours ago, is that a sun doesn't make a summer. And that's one of the sayings he is famous for. So how likely is it that what we saw in the first quarter is going to continue throughout all the 4 quarters and, of course, the years to come?
Let me give you 2 responses to that. The first does not rest in our hands because SARS does not create the economy. It also doesn't create economic conditions. So we did report that from an economic perspective, a component of the additional revenue came from specifically the mining and financial services and quarrying sectors in the first quarter. And that's a result of the commodity cycle, cyclical revenue flows based on commodity prices and the exchange rate of South African companies who earn in dollars. So very, very huge impact on that. We also saw that in corporate income taxes, particularly by those 2 sectors. We also saw in those 2 sectors, plus in some of the manufacturing sectors, we saw an increase higher than expected in domestic VAT. So those are all dependent on economic factors. That will always be cyclical as the business cycles goes through it. But the component that is sustainable, at least for as long as we have relatively low compliance levels, is the revenue yield from compliance activities. And if I tell you the huge amounts of uncollected debt, the huge large numbers of outstanding returns, the inefficiency still in our audit and investigative work that we know we can do much better, the high levels of corruption and criminal activities that we are just scratching the surface. Let me tell you, Vio, I have a strong conviction that as SARS builds its investigative and compliance capability, there are the unharvested benefit, revenue benefit, at least in our humble estimation, is well in excess of 100 billion rand every year.
So it's a matter of time before there is nowhere else to run for tax dodgers and for those who are engaged in all manner of fraudulent activities.
Well, so our 3 core business objectives. The first is, and it's based on our theory that most taxpayers are actually honest and they simply want to fulfill their obligation. So the first strategic objective for us is to work hard to continually clarify and communicate to taxpayers to gain the moral high ground and make sure that they understand their obligations, because we don't want to catch people doing things wrong. We don't want to be like the traffic officer who hides behind the tree and jump out and say, we caught you. We want to be ahead of the time. We want to say, there's a speed trap ahead. Please watch how you drive with clarity. The second is to make it easy for taxpayers to fulfill those obligations. You know, during the first 100 days of lockdown, we went hard to digitize another 30 and subsequently 45 digital online applications so that people could fulfill their obligations online. They didn't have to queue or come to our branches and put themselves at risk. That's some of the hard work we do. Using data analytics and artificial intelligence, we are targeting 3.6 million taxpayers this year. And our idea is to make it so easy for them to comply and fulfill the obligations that they don't have to do anything. We will use the third-party information already at our disposal. We will complete their assessment for them. We will present it to them, and if they agree, they simply accept it, and the job is done, and that can happen in under 5 minutes. We've also set ourselves the high bar that 80% of every assessment that is done online, we will assess in under 5 seconds. Last year, we performed at about 90%. We also said that 70% of all refunds that are due, provided there are no refund, no additional information or any additional verification work, we will pay taxpayers in under 72 hours. And if you are selected for audit, and it is a simple audit and you work with us, we will try and complete that in 21 days. So we've set for ourselves some performance standards that works in the interest of taxpayers. And it is that work that begins to gain momentum and have an endowment effect. In other words, it just doesn't deliver results once. It builds a virtuous cycle within SARS. And then our third strategic objective, also increasingly reliant on data and artificial intelligence, is the building our capability to detect and respond to non-compliance. Let me give you just 3 examples of what we've done in the last year and what we are currently busy with. When we became aware of the increasing levels of fraudulent VAT, by building in a certain algorithm, we're able to detect over 600 companies that had no intent to trade, and we prevented the outflow of 500 million rands of refunds. We did some interpolation work on the income tax side and looked at taxpayers with multiple properties who don't declare rental income, identified a large number of them, raised the additional assessment, and raised another 500 billion. Just between those 2 examples, another billion rand. We have recently worked through, also through data analytics, and discovered 26,000 taxpayers who have economic assets of over a million rand but are not registered for tax. So slowly but surely, to come back to your point, building the capability to detect and to respond to non-compliance. So increasingly, through instruments such as working with other revenue administrations around the world, we have, with over 100 countries, we have automatic exchange of data protocols. So if you're a South African who have an offshore account in any other country with which we have a data exchange protocol, they will automatically give us that information. And we can then use that information first to check that the money has been taken offshore legally, and secondly, it has been disclosed for tax purposes. That is how we know that there is more than 400 billion rand of assets offshore by South Africans. Now, we are not saying the entire 400 billion is irregular and not disclosed, but we must establish that as a matter of fact and not make an assumption either way. So those are some of the examples of the insights that we gain by a focused compliance program.
We've run out of time, Commissioner, but very, very quickly, how big would you say is the problem of illicit flows still?
Well, we don't talk about illicit flows only. We talk about tax crime or economic crimes, which includes illicit flows, but also other aggressive forms of tax crime. Through the work that we've done together with the Davis Tax Committee, we know that the unrecovered taxes in South Africa is conservatively over 100 billion rand.
That's where we're going to leave it this evening. Thanks very much for coming through, Commissioner Edward Kiswet, who is, of course, the head of the South African Revenue Services. After the break, the good, the bad, and the ugly of allowing people to withdraw a part of their pensions in order to survive these difficult times. Don't go away. Welcome back. This is the Watchdog. Finance Minister Tito Mboweni announced yesterday that he and his Treasury team were now more determined than ever before to make sure that they put everything that needs to be put in place to ensure that South Africans who have been hit hard by the pandemic are allowed to withdraw a part of their pensions to sort out some of their pressing challenges. Reaction from South Africans has been mixed. Our guest, Matthew Parks, has been part of year-long negotiations on this matter. He takes us through its origins and subsequent conversations that have been taking place at the National Economic Development and Labour Council, NEDLAC. Langa Madogo is the Deputy President of the South African Black Securities and Investment Professionals, APSIP. He's going to help us look at both the good and the bad that could come out of such a move. Let's welcome them. Good evening, gentlemen, and thank you so much for coming through. Matthew, COSATU has really been driving this. Why?
Sure. Look, we've been faced with our worst economic recession in South Africa in a century. We had to shut down the economy last year, as we all know, because of the pandemic. And millions of workers not only lost their jobs, but also lost wages. So we needed to provide every single bit of support we could to workers who are experiencing huge difficulties. And of course, many workers who, even though they might retain their jobs, are experiencing huge levels of indebtedness, are falling behind the home loan payments, other payments. They're supporting large numbers of unemployed relatives. Yet many workers have got significant funds saved up in the pension funds, which they can only access upon retirement, or if they resign from the work or are dismissed, then they can cash out everything. So we have said, look, let's give workers some relief in this moment of difficulty so they can survive, so they can keep up with their debt payments, so they can take care of their families, and allow them a limited access to their pension funds. It is their money, and when they're in their moment of difficulty, they should be allowed some sort of relief to enable them to survive, to get out of this crisis. And it also to help benefit the economy, because this is money which will be spent in the local economy, it will be spent paying off the debts and so forth. It was a difficult road. At first, government didn't want to agree with us. Eventually, we persuaded Treasury. You may recall that in October last year, the Minister of Finance did make a commitment to Parliament in his budget speech to do exactly this. But we've been disappointed that since that time, government has yet to table a bill at Parliament to effect this, because this requires an amendment of the existing pension laws. That takes a bit of time. It won't happen overnight. But we were quite pleased yesterday when the minister did respond to us again to say, yes, he's going to do it. He's going to make sure Treasury does it. We hope government will keep its word and that we will see a bill in Parliament by the end of this year so that this could come into effect in the second half or the end of next year.
Well, I'm glad you've raised the latter part of your input. The fact that there's, as far as you are concerned, the government has been rather tardy, on this one, which perhaps speak to the possibility that they were not keen on this in the first instance. And that, in fact, goes contrary to what many people have been saying today, that, this is a Tito invention or a Tito proposal, when in fact you are the ones who have been, driving this in the middle of a great deal of reluctance on the part of the government and some of the social partners at NEDLAC.
No, exactly. I mean, we raised this in May last year, more than a year ago. If government had moved to speed, by then it could have come into law already. In fact, when we also raised it at Parliament last year in our budget submissions, one of the Democratic Alliance members of Parliament actually drafted a bill, a private member's bill, providing for this. We had hearings at Parliament on that bill earlier this year. The ANC was quite interested and supportive of its objectives. Unfortunately, Treasury said they don't support it, that Parliament must wait for them to come with a bill. We are waiting. We hope they will not disappoint us again, because we don't have the luxury of time. As we've seen now with the violence in KZN and Gauteng, no one can predict when a crisis will happen. Equally, if you look at the levels of indebtedness of public servants and many other workers, it shows you there is a need to help workers, and workers should be allowed to access the money. We're also trying to avoid a worst-case scenario where many workers do resign from their work and they cash out their pension funds, because that you can do under the laws currently. And that creates the worst of two scenarios, because one, the worker resigns his job and is unemployed. Two, they deplete the entire pension funds, which puts them in a difficult spot when they hit retirement. So rather say, let's allow them a limited access to the funds. They can retain their jobs. They can also take care of their debts and their pressing needs. And also critically, this is workers' money. It's not government's money. It's not the employer's money. It's workers' money, and we should trust workers to have enough sense on how to manage it and to take care of their families.
It is workers' money, as you say, but it is where it is for very specific reasons. Did you consider other options, perhaps?
Sure. Look, we've put together a variety of packages to give relief to workers, to the families, to the country, the economy during this period. We had the tax relief last year and having it again now for companies which are struggling. We managed to pump out over 60 billion rand from the Unemployment Insurance Fund, benefiting more than 5.5 million workers who have lost wages, whose companies were struggling during this period. Again, we've managed to get the UIF to agree to release another 5 billion rand for this current period for the level 4 and level 3 restrictions, for the violence in KZN and Gauteng, etc. But we need to provide additional support, because each of these elements of support benefits certain categories of population. The 350 COVID-19 grant, which government has responded positively to our proposal to reinstate it, that'll benefit the unemployed person. So we need to look at a variety of tools to give a variety of relief to people. But also we were saying that we need to find the right balance, the sweet spot. We don't want to deplete the pension funds, because that will leave workers in poverty when they retire, forcing them to be dependent upon a small state pension. We also don't want to leave workers penniless or to cash out the entire pension. We don't want to see workers who've lost wages default in their home loans and have the banks repossess them. So we're trying to find the right balance. So we've said, allow workers the right to access up to 30% of their pension funds, allow them the choice whether to take out a loan against the pension fund or to take a simple cash withdrawal, but give them the choice, and then equally encourage them to save the remaining part, and encourage them to even to top up when they can later, when times are better. But right now, when times are at the worst in a century, we need to give every possible bit of support to workers. And this doesn't cost government a cent, because it's workers' money, it's not the state's money. And we appreciate the state has got very limited fiscal resources right now. So also saying this is what workers can do to assist workers and to assist their families in the economy.
Langa Madongo, let's bring you in here. He is the Deputy President of the Association of Black Securities and Investment Professionals, ABSIP. Now, the reason we brought you in was to say, let's look at this dispassionately. Let's look at the pros and cons of what COSATU has really been running with. And it would seem, looking at the responses of the other social partners at NEDLAC, it's gotten traction. It's a matter of when this thing needs to be done. And as the minister said yesterday, he is now going to make sure that the parties don't talk endlessly. This thing must be done now, since everyone is agreeing to it. Let's start with the pros. What good will come out? What good comes out? Not just this. What good comes out of withdrawing your pension?
I think, thank you very much, Vuyo. I think the first point that I can make is that ultimately, as Matthew has said, pension funds are the deferred wages of the members. So ultimately, it is their money and it is their prerogative ultimately on what must happen to it and when it must be accessed. So I think the first positive that comes out of it is that we definitely are in a time of crisis. We definitely find ourselves in a period where there is a need for people to access additional liquidity in terms of settling debt. Some of the measures that have been put in place to allow and to relieve the burden of the crisis on the members don't go as far as you possibly think they would. So people are left with numerous liabilities that they must service, whether it's the continued need to pay fees, the continued need to feed families, the continued need for them to service their liabilities, debt, housing bonds, and so forth and so on, remains and persists. So if the funds that are being withdrawn are going to be channeled towards addressing what are principal and fundamental needs of the worker in terms of how the money that is withdrawn is spent, then that's a good path. And I think we acknowledge and we accept that the crisis has left many people who particularly earn on the basis of the work that they provided, unable to meet some of their obligations, where some of the employers have gone and said that they are also unable to meet their obligation in terms of paying out where the employees or the workers are not able to provide the service that they underpin. So ultimately, it does ease the burden in terms of particularly the workers. And then I think
so used wisely, it could actually be to the advantage, or at the very least to the person who is doing it. What would be the examples? What would be examples of the kinds of things you could do if you find yourself in that situation? In other words, you would rather spend it on what than?
So I think some of the examples are, we all continue to have the responsibility to pay for education for our children. We all continue to have the obligation to service some of the liabilities around acquiring properties. We all continue to have the obligation to buy food and feed families. We all continue to have obligations around healthcare and the well-beings of ourselves and our family members. And those are just some of the examples of some of the uses that this could be put to, taking into consideration where we find ourselves in terms of the fact that some of the worker base might not be earning in this environment. So the opportunity to withdraw in that environment might mean you are able to continue to support, sustain your living environment.
Let's talk a bit about the bed.
So I think from the perspective of what could potentially be the harm that this would do is, one, we can't guarantee that the resources and the income that is withdrawn will be used appropriately. And it's at the discretion of the withdrawer to then determine how they will ultimately use those resources. And you have little or no control after it's withdrawn. Secondly, I think it does have an impact, particularly in a country like South Africa, where one of the big talking points has always been how pension funds at the point of retirement for members, the amount that is provided might not be sufficient for them to actually live out the rest of the period after retirement in terms of what they have in savings. I think the number that is touted generally around how much each pensioner might receive in terms of their retirement provision is quite low. It's about 120 to about 150,000 per member in the country in terms of what is the average pension savings that one would receive on retirement. And that in of itself is a challenge. And then the third element is that I think, speaking particularly to the government initiative to drive infrastructure spend, infrastructure is an illiquid asset class that takes quite a bit of time for it to pay out the full amount that is due. It does mean that from a pension perspective, you'd have to be rethinking how you allocate your investments. And you'd probably want to find yourselves in the more liquid asset classes like equities and preferably cash in anticipation of a crisis and in anticipation of a withdrawal into by the different members at the different points where they have a need to access their pensions.
Last one, very quick one from me, Blanga. Just two questions that I can take from social media on Twitter. Poshian Gomonde is asking can these pension withdrawals be taxed? If yes, would that be fair because it's borrowed money? And she's also asking at what interest. Do you know any of?
I think that's a question that's better posed to Matthew in terms of how he sees that playing out. But ideally, I think because it's a relief measure, you'd be anticipating that there would be minimal or maybe no tax in terms of how that is applied. Or are you looking at it in the same way that you treat a standard early withdrawal from a pension fund, and the tax principles that apply there would be the ones that apply? But let me throw the live snake to Matthew and see how he handles it.
Matthew, I'll give you the last word on that.
No, Sean, look, that's something that we've raised in our submission to Parliament and to Treasury. Look, currently your pensions are tax exempt as part of government's effort to encourage savings, and that's a correct approach. But I think also, as you know, as my colleague is saying, that people are withdrawing or want to withdraw in the moment of greatest need. And the last thing you want to see them is that small little money they have been saving up being further reduced by taxation. So we think ideally, there should be no tax, it should be tax exempt. You shouldn't be taking money when people are struggling to feed their families, to save their homes, to buy medication, etc. But if it has to be a compromise, then it should be at a minimal rate so that you don't avoid, if some poor person is getting 20,000 Rand or 15,000 Rand, you don't see it being depleted by heavy taxation. We think government can afford to be lenient because these are workers who are really struggling not because they want to buy luxuries, but simply struggling to save their families home, to buy food, to buy medicine, to make sure the kids can get to school, etc. So there needs to be a progressive and a fair compromise, but one that must favor the workers and not favor the state.
Thanks to both of you, gentlemen, Matthew Parks and Langa Madongo. Well, as we leave, we've been talking on the program in the past couple of months that this program has been running about a whole lot of things about how members of the executive and other people have actually at one point or the other failed us. So one of the issues that has been South Africans have been talking about a lot has been when President Cyril Ramaphosa is going to reshuffle the cabinet and get rid of those who are not performing, bring in new energetic people who are prepared to do what his government promised us when it got into power. Well, journalists today were where the president was, and they did put it to him, saying, Mr. President, when are you reshuffling your cabinet? And here was his response.
Process of people who are deployed to work with any leader even in a cabinet process, situation rather. It's a process that you evaluate, and it's best to leave it there because
it's not time, Mr. President.
It's best to leave it there, and it's a process that one does as one evaluates everything and everyone that you work with.
Will it happen or won't it? Well, time will tell. That's where we're going to leave it this evening. Do join us again tomorrow evening, same time. Have a good night.